everyone, welcome to another episode of Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. And today we're gonna talk about the debt trap myth. The developing countries are uniting through different organizations such as BRICS, ASEAN, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative. But I'm sure you all, to some extent, have heard about this negative report on Chinese investments overseas. For example, some media and academics are accusing China trapping countries in Africa and Latin America with great debt. But is that really the case? To really understand these projects, these investments, today I invited a special guest. His name is Hossein Askari. He is the Southwest Asia coordinator of the Schiller Institute. He's also the vice president of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. He did thorough research into those projects. So, Mr. Askari, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jingjing. I'm very happy to be with you.
Mr. Askari, if the Belt and Road Initiative is really as helpful as you just said to the developing countries, then why there's a huge negative news about Chinese investments in those regions? Where does all this negative news come from? Where does this debt trap diplomacy term come from?
Yeah, well, I can tell you a funny story first. When the U.S. Foreign Secretary Rex Tillerson under the Trump administration was going to Africa to warn African nations against working with China, a Chinese ambassador, I think it was in South Africa, he said, you know, the American ambassador, he lands in an airport in Africa, which was built by China. Then he travels by car on a road built by China. And then he goes and gives a speech in a building built by China. And then he tells people, be careful not to work with China. So that tells a very good story, because when you come to reality, it's completely different. Now, there are two things about the debt trap. Now, there are institutions I reference in my work, of course, that really debunk the whole myth of the debt trap, including American institutions. But there are two things. It's the size of the debt owed to China is not what people think. You know, as I wrote recently in my research articles on Sri Lanka and Pakistan, it's 10% in both countries. That's government debt. But for the international financial institutions, it's about 40 to 50 to 60%. There's another point which people don't pay attention to, is how is the debt incurred? Where do these nations use the debt or the loans they get from China and the loans they get from the West? The loans they get from China are invested in infrastructure, which means that modern infrastructure, as any sane human being knows, that clean water, electricity, better roads, better railways, better ports and airports and hospitals and schools improve the productivity of society. That's where the Chinese loans go. And when you improve your productivity, your ability to pay back increases. The loans from the West and from Japan and the Asian Investment Bank, which is not really Asian, it's Japanese, American, British, Australian, and so on. These loans are usually given in emergency situations to countries who are in trouble to cover their trade deficit and fiscal deficit. So that money evaporates immediately because you are not using that to solve the core problem, which is the lack of productivity in society, the lack of infrastructure, which is the source of the problem. But then this debt is piled upon each other. Now, there's another thing which comes from Western financial institutions. It's called the international bond markets, which Sri Lanka's problem is actually, and also Pakistan and many countries. These are private financial markets where governments go to borrow money when they can't get it from the IMF or the World Bank or somewhere else at low rates. They go and borrow money from these financial markets who are looking for profit. And they borrow this money also to cover deficit, not to build new things which will help them. And the interest rates are very high on these loans. But by time, these loans just become bigger and bigger, and the countries don't manage to pay them back. So what the financial institutions, like big investors in the United States, for example, BlackRock and a British fund called Ashmore, I mean, they have trillions of dollars in their funds, and they buy the debt of countries. So what they do, they sell this debt to other so-called vulture funds. I mean, vultures, which eat cadavers. And these funds then make profit by buying the debt of these poor countries who are in trouble. And then they demand full payment in time, otherwise they get punished. So that's what you discover, is that not only that China's share of the debt of those countries is small, China's loans are qualitatively different because they help those countries cope with their problems, while the debt incurred from Western institutions, they worsen the situation. And these countries become hostage to conditionalities and political, like Sri Lanka. Now there's a huge investment by the United States, not in infrastructure, but in political groups to move them into the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy away from China and their neutral policy. So that's where, but the story where it comes from, and I did a lot of research on that myself, but there was, if you look at the internet and try to search where this thing started, it started in earnest in May 2018. There is nothing before that except for a few discussions in India by anti-Chinese groups who were pissed off with the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, that India is losing Sri Lanka. So they came up with this term, debt trap, for strategic reasons. But the real story started in May when the State Department, not through a press release, but they sent out a report, a study, to all the big media in the world. It was a study, not, they say it's an academic study from Harvard, but I can show you. Okay, so the report I mentioned that the State Department distributed to the international media in the middle of May. Now here it said that this is the report. It's called Debt Book Diplomacy: China's strategic leveraging of its newfound economic influence and the consequences for U.S. foreign policy. Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard Kennedy School. So this is Harvard, It was written by two characters, Sam Parker and Gabriele Shevitz. Now, Sam Parker he's not an economist, neither Mrs. Shevitz. They come from security and military intelligence sections. So they have no idea about economics and finances, and they don't talk about these things in the report, actually. Parker comes from the Homeland Security Department, which was established after 9/11. Mrs. Shevitz, more interesting, she worked at the Defense Department, but now she works in a defense think tank. She was supposed to become Biden's defense minister. So those people have nothing to do with economics, but they made this very big report about how China is entrapping nations in debt to promote its military strategic advances. And the report, and that's what the real story is, was commissioned by the State Department. So those two guys in Harvard did not come up with the idea themselves. They were commissioned. They were told by the State Department to write the report about this theme. Now, they removed that from the PDF file, but I still have internet reports from the media. Look, May 23rd, 2018. And it says the US Department has, in a report commissioned by it and made public recently, warned that China is offering blah, blah, blah. Okay? The same thing. This is in Sri Lanka. This is also May 18. So in many reports in the media, it says that the State Department commissioned this study. So those scholars in Harvard did not come up with the idea themselves. They were told to write it. And then it was sent back to the State Department. And the State Department said, oh, look, we found this fantastic scientific report from Harvard, which tells the story of how China. But then the same year, the State Department, its financial report to the Congress to ask for more money for the next financial year. What they say there is interesting, because they say that they had 2018, they had a multi-language team of linguists and narrative specialists working with the department's Bureau of International Information Programs and so on. And it says that we observed growing use of the term debt trap diplomacy to describe Chinese investments. And then they say the department continues to message on this subject, delivering additional high-performing materials, including Harvard study warns of perilous debt trap diplomacy. So all American embassies all over the planet, they spread this material to the media, to NGOs, to activists, bloggers, and of course paid money in that process. So the State Department is saying, look, give us more money so we can put out more dirt on China in international media. So Congress, especially under the Trump administration, and in even under Biden, they gave more money to anti-Chinese propaganda. And this was a bill which was passed in the Senate unanimously. I mean, the two parties in the United States, they fight against about everything, but they agree on Russia and China and the terrible US policies internationally. So this is Strategic Competition Act of 2021. And it says there should be authorization of $300 million a year for 5 years. So each year, $300 million will go to the fund for countering Chinese influence through the State Department. Now, the State Department has an office, it's called Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor Office, which has branches in every American embassy in the world. And what is their job? Well, they will take the money appropriated to them by Congress. And what they do is that they will train local media around the world to, both find bad things about China and the Belt and Road Initiative. So the United States creates the story, a fake story, and they say, oh, the fake story has spread all over the world. But we are spreading them. Now we need the people in those countries themselves to spread the story so it becomes more credible. So if somebody in Iraq or Sri Lanka or in South Africa, from that country, a journalist or activist starts saying these things, then it will have more credibility than we saying this. So the money went through, and there was this big scandal in Zimbabwe last September 2021, where the government discovered, Zimbabwe is now the largest cooperation partner with China. They have many cooperation agreements with China, many Chinese investments, and the government is in a volatile situation. Elections are coming, and the story came out that the US Embassy in Zimbabwe was organizing courses for journalists, bloggers, and civil society NGOs and activists who are against the government to train them how to write bad things about the Belt and Road and Chinese investments in Zimbabwe. And one of the participants leaked out that they were offered $1,000 for each article or video or whatever. Now, so you see the whole story, how it was built up, how it was spread. And unfortunately, people buy this story because it's all over the place. Nobody cares about checking the facts. I spent many hours reading through the Pakistani and Sri Lankan central bank records. Now, of course, not everybody is able to do this terrible work, to figure out what they are saying there, with the numbers, and you compare the numbers and also. But there's a horrendous lack of, a moral stance to be able to say, well, this is not true. Let us look at this, look at the details, and so on and so forth. But then there's this peer pressure, this enormous pressure in the media everywhere to believe these lies because people are surrounded by them the whole time. So that's really where the whole debt trap thing started, and it continues. I mean, it was debunked many times. I mean, I wrote about this already in 2018 when this story came out. I pointed at where it comes from, the source of it. But of course, I don't have the same ability as the Western media and the State Department to reach out to people in the world. But it is getting out to a relatively good number of people. But it's important is that people in governments in Africa, in Asia, in South America, they don't believe this thing. That's why, and this is what is an irony, the more bad things they say about the Belt and Road, the more nations join it. Didn't anybody ask that question? If it's so bad, if it has been bad since the beginning, why so many countries are joining it? They're joining it because they realize that this is the fantastic way of economic cooperation, developing the countries, and the idea of win-win is true. It's not a trick, it's not a tactic. Our job is not to promote China. Our job is, not job, but our mission as a Schiller Institute is to make sure that Sweden, Europe, and the United States joins the project rather than works against it, because it's beneficial for us here, not only for China or the developing countries.